to everyone. It's my great pleasure to introduce our symposium on the new politics of class with two fantastic speakers. We'll start with Joel Kotkin in his first session this morning on the new class divides and their implications for the future. Joel will be known to all of you. Just to introduce him briefly, he is a presidential fellow at Chapman University in, I guess it's Orange County, isn't it?
Yeah,
in California.
And the city of Orange.
Yeah, Orange that's right. So the city of Orange in Orange County, the heart of the metropolitan elite on the West Coast. And that is, I think, precisely what Joel will be talking about, though in, I think, slightly less flattering terms than perhaps people who live in Orange might think. But Joel is a long-standing friend and associate of Telos, of the journal, of Telos Press, of our publishing house, of really the Telos family, if I may say. Most notably, he published with us his 2014 book called The New Class Conflict. And then more recently, he's also published a book, again, on similar themes on the coming of neo-feudalism. And I think what's really significant about Joel's interventions and Joel's work is to put class, again, front and center of our political and social and economic analysis. For a long time, it was felt that class was outmoded. It was linked to the Industrial Revolution and to 20th century Fordism, and that, with globalization, with the service and knowledge economy, that somehow class would drop out and new things would be far more important. Maybe age and assets, or educational attainment, or geography, or all sorts of things that people claim was going to supersede and possibly replace class altogether. And yet, of course, class has not so much returned to the fore because it's never gone away. Class has always been there, it's mutated, and I think some of those mutations Joel has charted in his work. The changes, for instance, not just to the working class in a post-industrial society, but also the changes to the middle class. That on the one hand, the middle class is now sliding into forms of precariousness, depossession, alienation, and so on. And on the other hand, of course, a part of the middle class is sort of mutated into something like the professional managerial class. So dominant in education, politics, finance, the arts, and so on. So all these class mutations only make the point that we cannot understand politics now or going forward without understanding exactly what class is and is becoming. So we're incredibly delighted to welcome Joel for his talk, and let me, please ask me in welcoming Joel Kotkin as our first keynote speaker.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. It's when I think back about how issues evolve. When I first met with Mary, I had been publishing with Random House for 10, 15 years, and I was saying to them, the big issue that's going to come up is going to be class. You just look at what's happening with incomes, you're looking at what's happening with home ownership, you're looking at what's happening through technology. And I was thinking, well, okay, the publisher lives at 1 Fifth Avenue and has a country house. My editor lives in Boerum Hill and also has a country house. Well, maybe they don't think there's a problem, and maybe they never talk to anybody who may actually be affected by it, maybe not even in their own family. So the class issue was very, very difficult to discuss, particularly if you discussed it outside of sort of a dogmatic, Marxist or analysis. I'm not necessarily saying what Marx did was bad, but some of it was. But the reality is that this is a much bigger issue, and people were writing about this and talking about this, well before Marx. So anyway, I think it's really an important issue. I think one of the weird things of the last few years has been the obsession on gender, environment, and and race as opposed to class. And I think that in a lot of ways, and I've been writing a lot about this, this is being funded, these efforts are largely being funded by the people who are actually the beneficiaries of the current structure. I mean, Jeff Bezos isn't going to give, $10 billion for, for trying to figure out how people can confiscate his wealth. But he will put it in climate change where he'll make money and the middle class, the policies they're using now, the middle class won't do so well. So anyway, that was just a little preface. So let me see if we can get this to work. Here we go. No. Oh my God, all right. Okay, so let's, can we go up one? Okay, then down. Okay. All right, so I want to just talk a little bit about, you can hear me, right? Yeah. Okay. So what we're clearly seeing is sort of the end of this neoliberal period, and Putin and Xi have sort of pushed us even more rapidly into that. One of the interesting things is assets are more concentrated. There's really been an interesting discussion from some of the free market fundamentalists, like, let's say, Phil Graham, who say, oh, we don't have that much inequality. Look at all the transfer payments, and that's reduced poverty. And that's true. And you know what? If we want to just keep giving checks out, I suppose we can get rid of it. It doesn't do much for the middle class, but at the end of the day, this is a group that just becomes dependent on what Marx called the proletarian alms bag. Assets, where the power is. If you don't own a home, or you don't own any property, you're basically going to be dependent on the state, most likely for the rest of your life. So that's sort of the direction we're headed. The demographic stagnation, now it's very different than what drove it in the Middle Ages, but there is a sense that I'm not going to have children if I don't think either the world's going to come to an end in an environmental apocalypse, or I don't want to recreate the patriarchy or whatever reason there is for not having children. And in those days, in the Middle Ages, about a quarter of the population was celibate. So from what frankly, I'm just amazed when I see students at campus, because when I went to Berkeley, which of course was many, many centuries ago, the biggest interest of males was females. And I don't get that same reading out of most of my students these days. It's a very different environment. Decline in literacy. Anybody here who teaches I think will validate this point of view that people are coming into college, in particular, with much less knowledge of history. I find that they're very good with the technology. They're very good, let's say, doing a PowerPoint presentation and all that, but they really have very little background. Even I teach a class on propaganda, and it was sort of funny. I've ended up having to teach some of the history of Christianity to a bunch of Gentiles, and I'm Jewish, so it's because they barely know who St. Paul is. I mean, this is a big change over the last 10 to 15 years. When the only kids generally who have any religious background at all are the ones are the children of mostly Mexican immigrants. About a third of our students now at Chapman are Hispanic. The woke ideology is the new theology. The parallels between the woke ideology and the climate apocalypse ideology in the Middle Ages is really almost funny, but it's the same thing. The world is coming to an end. Somebody I disagree with isn't wrong or maybe a little bit deluded. They're evil, and that's very much from the Middle Ages. We are seeing peasant rebellions all over the world. One of the pieces I'm going to be doing the next month or so is a tremendous pushback in rural America against the agenda of the Greens, who basically just want to cover large parts of the countryside with solar panels. So they feel better, but they're not going to put the solar panels in Brooklyn. And what's next? So let me just give you a little bit of what I think the essence of feudalism is. And again, it's not a perfect analogy. I'm not a I'm not a medieval historian. I'm sure, historian could pick apart specifics without any problems. But I'm just in the big concept, concentration of property in a few hands. That's probably one of the biggest things. What we're seeing, like here in New York City, one of the reasons that there is you would think that there would have been a big correction on rents. A lot of it is because people are buying Airbnbs. And the investors, so there'll be fewer and fewer people who own their own places and more people who will, things that will be owned by investors. Lack of upward mobility, we'll talk about that. The decline in the middle class, we'll talk about that. And again, I think it's very important to reiterate, parts of the middle class are doing well. If you're an upper echelon bureaucrat at the National Institute of Health, you're doing fine. If you're teaching at UCLA, you get to retire at 60, 62 years old with, we know some people, $150,000, $200,000 a year defined benefit pension. I can tell you, in the real world, not many people have that. Even successful people don't have that. And of course, literacy, which we discussed. So, you want to just do the next one? Okay. Now, this is from the House of Commons, that about 1%, top 1% by 2030, if we stay in the current pattern, will go from about 50% to about 64%. So there's this inexorable concentration of assets, and that continues to happen almost no matter what's happening in the economy. But it's one of the realities. Get the next slide, please. And we can see that the middle class has obviously been declining. The big increases in wealth are in the, not necessarily even the top 1%, although they do well, but the top 0.1% and the top 0.001%. That's where the big gains have taken place. Go to the next one. And you can see, generally speaking, in the U.S., it's the top 20% have done better, and obviously the poor parts of the population have not done well. Now, there has been, again, there is a effect from all the COVID transfers and income supports. And there are people who think that this is going to be the beginning of a permanent welfare state where a large percentage of the population doesn't work at all, doesn't even participate in the workforce. Like, I'm reading Nick Aberstad's book right now, and it's really interesting because it's not necessarily that people that everybody is doing great. It's just that there's more and more transfer payments, and now people are saying, well, why bother working? And I think when Mike talks about the what's happening with low-income workers, you can see why they don't want to work. Like, my oldest daughter works at Home Depot in Tucson, and it's really quite interesting, the problems they have with people not showing up at work and people just simply not wanting to work. Next. Okay, so this is the share of assets, and as you can see, there's been a pretty steady increase of the ownership of assets by a relatively small group of people. I go to the next one. And the other thing that's happening is we have greater concentration of corporate assets. Almost every major industry has now consolidated and keeps consolidating. I don't know if you read just recently that Kroger is going to buy Albertson. So now we're going to have fewer and fewer options. Things will be owned by a smaller and smaller group of companies. And that's been particularly marked in the technology world. I mean, it's amazing that we have allowed Microsoft to have 90% of the operating system software. You wonder why they don't make their software any better. They don't have to. When you've got 90% of the market, you do whatever you please. And we see this with Google. I mean, I don't know about you, but I think Google is worse now than it was 10 years ago. And now that it's become very politicized, like when I'm doing research, if it's on an issue like climate or race or gender, I have to go to a different search engine because they've so implanted sort of their, in quote, values on their own search engine. What was great about Google originally is it gave you what people were going to, and sometimes you agreed, sometimes you didn't. Now I find, like, if I want to do something, let's just a simple question like natural gas is the biggest source of reductions in GHG, okay, and that's clear. Try to find that on Google. You had to go into about 4 or 5 pages before I could find it. Similar thing on issues of race and gender. It's just essentially, once you get to that stage where you can control everything, there's no need to be competitive. The other thing that we're seeing is that these companies now buy any of the innovative companies. So today, a lot of VCs will tell you that they don't even build companies to go public. They build them to be acquired. And Mike Malone has a really great essay about what's happened to Silicon Valley. I wrote my first piece on Silicon Valley in 1975 for the Washington Post, and it's unbelievable to me how different it is now, how much more hierarchical it is, how much less innovative. The pace of change, particularly in the 80s, was really astounding. There was always somebody coming up with something new that was challenging other people. And now, you know, we really haven't seen the rise of a major big tech company in quite a while now, which is not healthy. Next, please. And of course, tremendous dominance of the stock market. I mean, one of the reasons that the tech stocks will never completely tank is that huge amounts of the holdings of the major institutions are in these companies, and they're and you can see you have in NASDAQ almost 30 at one point 30% was basically owned from a small group of companies, the top 10, most of them tech companies. Go to the next one. But it's not just here. I mentioned the Kroger merger, but you can see, you know, top 4 companies, 84% of beef, 66% of hogs, 60% of poultry, 70% of soybeans. So we're seeing, even in the food supply, a very small number of companies that are pretty dominant. And next, please. So here's what I think is coming: a generational class conflict, and well, not everybody here is an older cockler, but those who are, well, maybe we'll be gone before this really happens. So home ownership is in decline. That is clear. One of the reasons for the movement of people to Texas, to Florida, to other states, is that if you're 30 years old and you don't have rich parents and you didn't rob a bank, you're probably going to have to go someplace else if you want to buy a house. And that was not the case in California. We always had somewhat higher prices, but it was never like this. Basically, the boomers will dominate assets well into the 2030s. This is a really bad part. More children are doing worse than their parents. That was always a big thing in America, was I would do better than my parents. Now, to some extent, the parents did better, so maybe it's harder to catch up. You know, if you're like my grandfather was a window washer, it wasn't hard for my mother, becoming a nurse, to do better than him. Now, it may be a little bit more difficult in the next generation. But the fact is that young people increasingly don't see themselves as free agents, people who can create their own lives. And I just finished an article about this, about how much they now depend on inheritance. Most millennials, and even more so the Zs, look at inheritance as the main way that they would ever buy a house. And of course, people are pessimistic, and that has all sorts of implications. So next, please. So what we're seeing here is the home ownership, and again, you can see how millennials at the same age were doing considerably worse than other generations. You know, I remember I bought my first house in Hollywood for $150,000 in 1979. And you know, yes, I mean, currencies change, but that was something, you know, if I bought the same house in Denver, it would be $80,000. But the fact is that there was entry. That's one of the hard parts for New York City, for LA, for San Francisco, even more so, Seattle, is the cost of entry is so high that people can't go buy a house and stay in the neighborhood, and that has political effects, which I'll try to get into as well. And go to the next one, please. And that's if you don't if home ownership goes down, it's going to be very hard on the middle class. The house is the asset. I can tell you, both my mother-in-law and my mother, what made their last years comfortable was that they could sell a house and they have a few $100,000 so they can live in a nicer place in their last years. I don't think people are thinking about that. What's going to happen to a generation of people who are renters and have no real assets? Certainly not assets that they control, because, you know, the Wall Street assets are controlled by somebody else. Next one, please. This I thought was really interesting. This is from Deloitte. And what they're basically saying is that by 2030, the boomers will still have almost 50% of all the wealth. So there's going to be pressure. Now, one of the things we talk about, particularly in California, is in order to expand the welfare state, which seems to be what the goal is, as opposed to increasing higher wage employment. So, you know, what you have now is you've got a situation where people are saying, well, maybe we ought to go after the assets of the boomers. Let's say if you have a house that's worth $2 million, but you're not selling it, they're going to say, well, we're going to take what the value that's increased and we'll put a capital gains on it. I think the only way the current progressive environment works, given their policies in other areas, is going to be confiscation of the middle class over time. The money's got to come from somewhere, and unfortunately, we're the ones who have it. Next, please. And this is the children earning more than parents. I thought that's really, if you think about it, it went from 90% to 50%, and I'm sure now it's below 50%. So that's a very scary thing for any society. I mean, I don't want to go too far with this, but this is exactly the kind of thing that happened in Germany and even in Italy at the time of Mussolini. There's reasons why things happen, and it's not all because of Donald Trump or Fox News. People are angry, and they're angry for a good reason. Next. And this idea is not just in the U.S. Pessimism is even worse in France and Greece. Spain's about the same. Italy's about the same. So basically, most people think that the next generation is not going to do well. That is, think about casting a pall over the future. And one of the things I'm trying to think about now, since I've done all this stuff that I guess is somewhat negative, I'm going to try, how do we get out of it? How does a society move into a better direction? I mean, after the Middle Ages, there was the Renaissance. How do we get back to that? Next. All right, so here's the structure. There's at the top are the tech oligarchs, Wall Street, the major property owners. The tech oligarchs are, to me, they remind me of the barbarians after the fall of the Roman Empire, who just seized the territory. You know, look, sometimes you think there and say, how did the book industry not know that selling books online was going to change everything? I mean, how stupid were the networks in not getting into streaming till very late? And part of it is that, you know, people have an installed base and they don't want to change. So to give these guys credit, they went into a market that was being largely open to them. I mean, think about Uber and Lyft. I mean, no cab company thought about this. So give them credit, just like you maybe give credit to the barbarians who, you know, conquered particular areas. The clerisy, I think, is one of the interesting concepts. It's Samuel Coleridge came up with the term, and it's basically what used to be the first estate in France, the clergy, but now it's the scientific experts. And what we're seeing now in a very medieval way, we just passed a bill in California, I don't know if any of you followed it, where a doctor can be sued or held accountable if the doctor gives a patient advice that's not approved by CDC. That's basically what they're saying. We're seeing the same thing with climate. If you don't, I'm not talking about deniers, I'm saying maybe Bjorn Lomborg or Steve Koonin has a different take on, or Judith Curry about it. Now they're going to say, no, you can't even get those views, or there'll be something knocked on it. It's really quite scary. And so what we have is this group of people who are basically above criticism, very much like the medieval clergy. You know, one of the things I always try to tell my students is, you know, this idea that education makes people more liberal is not, it might make them more radical, but it certainly doesn't make them more liberal. And if you studied, for instance, the Third Reich, Hitler was very popular in the universities. And there were, of course, many professors who were happy to get rid of the gay, Jewish, and communists who were also in the universities. But, you know, there was a description, Frederick Spatz talks about Nazism as being a movement of the young and a movement of the intellectuals. So, you know, we have this idea there were a bunch of people, you know, knuckle dragging. And yes, they were knuckle dragging, but there were a lot of people with doctorates who were along with them. Then there's a yeomanry, which I think is basically the private sector middle class, and they've been hammered. They're hammered before COVID, during COVID, and what we find in California, you know, because I always think of, I mean, my sense of it is that the Biden administration has decided to try to turn the country into California, and what's happened is, and I'll talk a little bit about California. It's not such a great model. But what's happened is that the small business people, constant things like you can't use natural gas, you have to have this kind of thing, and you have to, the expenses that are made, and then we now have legislation where, you know, in certain industries, you know, basically you're going to have the SEIU determining wages at the statewide level. I mean, this is stuff out of Argentina or some other country, not the United States, but that's happening. So that class is gotten very alienated. And by the way, the strongest base of Donald Trump is Main Street business owners. They have been the strongest backers of MAGA, and you can understand. You don't have to agree with it, but you need to understand it. And then there's the class that I think, you know, we're going to see more and more of, which is the serf class. People who will never own property, never have a business. And, you know, I think sometimes, you know, the idea is, well, we'll give them $2,000 a month. They can water their plants, smoke pot, watch pornography, and then lose themselves in the metaverse. We're doing a lot of work on the metaverse, which is a very scary thing if you ever want to get into it. But basically what Zuckerberg is saying is life is so crappy that we're going to live in this alternative universe that we can create for you. And that's sort of one of the directions we're going to. There's a famous novel from Stanislaw Lem called The Futurological Congress, and it's about the guy who's he's a futurist, he goes to a conference, everything's great, and then he starts thinking, wow, things aren't working so well, and everything really smells. It turned out it was a pill that he had taken before the conference, and then when it wore off, reality struck, which maybe is what we're seeing. Next, please. So the Clarity, I'm a big fan of Daniel Bell. I think by the way, The Coming of Post-Industrial Society is, I think, one of the most important books of the 20th century, and for many times, I almost could not get a copy. I mean, how we get rid of our own history. And he was talking about this, what he called the priesthood of power, the people who will want the rational ordering of mass society. And it's very natural for people, particularly with a technological bent, to think that way. Next one. And this, of course, was pushed in many cases. Look at the enormous increase in the number of people going to college. So this now has much more influence. I mean, you're going from 7.4 million in 1970 to 21 million. But here's an interesting thing, which maybe we can talk about later. College enrollment's starting to drop. The elite colleges like Stanford, they're going to be fine, but but a lot of kids are saying, it's not worth it. And you know what? They're right. If you're not in one of the top schools, or you have very much a skill base, particularly technical skill, you may be better off learning how to be a plumber, learning how to be an electrician, having a food truck. You might be better off with those things. The percentage of kids with college degrees who are working in non-college jobs is about 50%. And there's a lot of numbers on that. Can we go to the next one, please? And so what's happened is, as this currency has grown, because that's, you know, you think about it, where does a Cal State Fullerton graduate in political science get a job? The government. I mean, that's basically what they're going to end up with. And so what we've had is this enormous growth in regulatory, and what really bothers me is, and whether it's Trump or Biden, we have a dictatorship. You know, every 4 years we elect a dictator who then rules by executive decree. Now, some of it is the problem with Congress, but there's definitely this idea that we don't have to go through these processes. I thought it was very interesting. I think today that Biden decided to extend the COVID emergency for another 60 days, which gives him near dictatorial powers. I mean, it's not the Enabling Act, I'll say that. We still have a Supreme Court, they haven't gotten rid of that yet. But you can see where this society is going. And again, it could be both sides. I have no more confidence having Donald Trump be a dictator than Joe Biden be a dictator. But next. And as you can see, the hold on the economy, you can see that more and more of the economy is based around regulation. In California, and those who are here from California, it's the regulatory regime is incredible. I mean, let me put it this way, I've run business in California. I would never have a full-time employee in California. It would just be the chance of them saying something, then you're going to court. It's not worth it. So luckily for me, my main researcher lives in Stockholm. So I sort of avoid that. So oddly enough, she's in the socialist country, but I'm better off with her there. Next one. All right, now California, get to talk about California. Okay, high regulation state. I mean, just almost beyond belief. If you talk to somebody who's operating a business, you'll hear incredible stories. The state is run essentially by public employees, the tech companies, and the nonprofits. And the green nonprofits are funded mostly by the tech companies. So they're just, you know, and of course, just to be cynical, why should I be cynical? To just be cynical, what you have is you have the tech companies and the investment banks see in the energy transition an amazing opportunity for profiteering. You know, when you put, let's say, a solar farm up in California, you're guaranteed a return. And you can imagine in this environment, that would be very attractive. So, I mean, a lot of things are happening for reasons that now, look, I don't think, like, you know, my mentor was the late Michael Harrington. And he always used to say, don't assume that people are sociopaths. There aren't that many sociopaths. They think they're doing God's work or Gaia's work, depending on how you put it. You know, I'm going to put all this money into these nonprofits who are going to essentially try to wipe out the oil industry, and then I'll invest in these green things, which will give me guaranteed returns. And that's sort of what's happening in California. And so in the same process, a lot of negative things are happening for the middle class. We have very bad production of middle wage jobs. So if you look at, you know, Biden, I think the LA Times said, Biden wants to turn America into California again. Unfortunately, it's not the California of the Beach Boys. It's a very different California. So we have very poor production of middle class jobs. I'll show you that. Rapid deindustrialization. We had an incredible industrial complex in the Valley, Silicon Valley, and Los Angeles was the manufacturing center of the entire country. That is just eroding. And of course, who's losing out work? Working class, predominantly Hispanics. And my friend Jennifer Hernandez has written a lot about this, and she calls it the green Jim Crow. And I think that's pretty accurate. We'll go to the next one. So here you can see what we saw here in California. from 2008, 2018, we created 1.5 million jobs that paid below the average pay level. A huge percentage of those are 40,000 and under. Now, they may be a little bit higher now because there's inflation, but I don't think people are going ahead. And you can see, yeah, there have been some really good jobs created in California, although that's getting a little bit more questionable due to remote work. But the reality is that we have not produced a middle-class economy. Next slide. And we've been tracking that compared to other states and other regions. So you can look at the multiple of 100,000 a year jobs for every 40,000. Now remember, if you start doing it, adjusting for cost, then it really gets outrageous. But you can see what's happened: Salt Lake, Seattle, Cleveland, Austin, even Baltimore, which is obviously the Baltimore suburbs. U.S. Orange and Silicon Valley are below, and LA is below. So what's happening is that these kinds of hyper-regulated economies are not places where lots of high-wage jobs are created. And then remember, very high-wage jobs. Look at, if you graduated from MIT in artificial intelligence, Silicon Valley is where you want to go. You can go anywhere you want. But for a lot of people, like what we're seeing is the group that's really declined in California is the skilled blue-collar sector. That's where we've seen the biggest losses, and and then you add to that cost. Just like one interesting statistic is we adjusted African American incomes by cost, and Mississippi came out a little bit higher than California. That's pretty astounding, if you know the history particularly. Next. And of course, we have the highest cost of living adjusted poverty rate in the country. And it's amazing to me. I'll read pieces and they say, California is the model of social justice. I said, really? Is this social justice? Lack of good jobs and a high poverty rate. And if you go to the next slide, how do we get out of it? It is not going to be solved by Silicon Valley. So let's take a look at Silicon Valley. You can see this is how it looks like. Small group at the top, skilled professionals, the gig workers, and the untouchables, who are completely marginal. Go to the next slide. Now, what we're seeing is California's got a lot of rich people, and the Bay Area in particular has a lot of rich people. And then if you look at rich people under the age of 40 or under the age of 50, the overwhelming. New York City is not producing new rich people who are in their 40s and 50s in anything like the numbers we've seen in Silicon Valley. So that's the positive side of it, but there's also a negative. Go to the next one. I always appreciate Antonio Martinez for saying the great phrase, feudalism with better marketing. And that's basically what you see now in Silicon Valley. That's the model that's being created. There's no, we're looking here in California. We did basically invented semiconductors and the electric car, the current iteration. There, except for the original Tesla plant, which was given to him, there's none of that work is going to California. Semiconductors, none of that work is going to California. In terms of the manufacturing, there'll still be design and marketing. Some of that will still stay, although I think some of that will go as well. But it's very much a very top-down economy. By the way, Silicon Valley in the 80s was the exact opposite. It had one of the most egalitarian economies in the country, and it was filled with Vietnamese boat people who were doing, who were doing PC board insertions and building businesses. I traveled to China my first time as an honorary ethnic Chinese, which obviously I'm not, with a bunch of guys, all of whom came from China, all of whom went to Silicon Valley, and we're now looking at opportunities in China. Now, this is 1982. So, clearly, there was something really exciting happening in the Valley at that time. I don't think what's happening now is so exciting. Next. And of course, the big problem is housing. That's where people get their money. So if people can't buy houses, getting into the middle class is difficult. And again, I think that's why you're starting to see this migration, or you've been seeing the migration first to Seattle, then to Denver, now to Phoenix, of course Austin, Dallas, and we're looking at where the skilled professionals are going, because even somebody, if you live in Orange County right now, you can't afford a decent house unless you have a family income of about $300,000. The Silicon Valley is probably worse. Now, you could buy a tiny little place in a bad neighborhood where you can't send your kids to school, but I don't know if that's worth it. Next. Can we get, okay. And just to show that this is unique, and part of it is California decided, for climate reasons is part of what they're saying, we're not going to build any new suburbs. We're not going to build any, the way cities traditionally expand is they expand up, but they also expand out. By expanding out, you reduce the price of property, makes it much cheaper to build. California has made this almost impossible. It is almost impossible to build things now. There are some developments that have taken 30 years, and that's still, right? Tejon Ranch is a good case outside of LA. So as you can see, what's happened, affordable, the median income, you can see how much LA has dropped. Now, LA actually does worse than the Bay Area because although the Bay Area has slightly higher prices, they have much higher incomes. But LA has got this terrible combination of very high costs and low incomes. It's not a good look. Next. And again, home ownership, you can see declines. Now, one of the things we're finding is that migration, particularly of African Americans, is out of California. The LA was about, one time we were close to 20% black, now it's about 8% black. Now it's been replaced by Hispanics, and of course there's a lot of narrative about that. But what's happening is people are moving. So if you're Hispanic or black in particular, you're much more likely to own a house in Houston than you are to own a house in Palo Alto. I mean, it's just, or in the Bay Area, almost anywhere. And by the way, many times the owners are the elderly. In other words, people who bought 30, 40 years ago, or 50 years ago, but the young people aren't. Next. And of course, we have things like very high electricity rates. Our gas is getting close to $7. I don't know if the Bay Area is at that, I'm sure. You know, now look, I make a pretty good living. I work at home. I use a tank of gas a month just because I don't drive very much. Okay, I'll deal with it. Maybe I won't eat sushi one night. For a working class person with an F-150 driving from Riverside to Long Beach every day, this is ruinous. Like the other day, I put gas in the car, and the car before me was an F-150. The guy had spent $150 on gasoline. Now, he can't possibly be making enough money to make up for that. So as you can see what our energy prices are, and one of the weird things about California, we have enormous amounts of oil and gas. Just incredible amounts. So what do? We've been importing it from Russia and from Saudi Arabia, who of course both epitomize California progressive values. Next. And then this is the part that I find really disturbing, which is the education system. We spend quite a bit now on education in California, and the results are terrible. Particularly for poor kids, the chances of them ever getting any kind of really significant training, plus when you're throwing in all the PC garbage, and they just, I mean, I even have kids who they're mostly upper middle class kids from suburban high schools, and their skills are much less than they were 10 years ago. But the young kids coming up from these terrible schools, and we have no way of fixing them. San Francisco, by the way, does the worst of any school district in California in educating poor kids. Now you think about it, there's a wealthy city with all sorts of resources, but you know, well, if you follow the school board elections, you know why. Next. So where are we headed now? I think there's going to be a real battle over wages. This $15 an hour, now it's $23 an hour. I don't know what happens to the franchises if we go to $23 an hour. I don't know how they're going to stay in business. My fear is what will happen is, if we go to the next slide, I can sort of illustrate, is everything will become roboticized. right after California passed the new franchise law, a good friend of mine, who's a tech guy, he got a call from In-N-Out Burger saying, can you, we'll give you $1.5 million. Figure out how we can get people out of making the hamburgers. And if you go to an In-N-Out, I know you don't have that here, but I assume it'd be Five Guys would be similar. You know, it's a bunch of young, mostly young kids, maybe kids in college, maybe working a part-time job. Now what you're going to end up with is a small group who will do better, but huge numbers. We figure somewhere about 200,000 jobs will probably go. And that's where we're headed, is and a lot of times we're not even necessarily making it more profitable or more efficient. We just are getting rid of labor. And what business people tell me, and I'm involved with a group of business people trying to turn things around, who almost all Democrats, by the way. But part of what the problem is, you don't know what's coming next. That's always the thing that the business said. I can't invest here because who knows what those lunatics are going to come up with next. Okay, next. So how do we address it? I think the main thing is there's a real skills shortage. That is sure. State of Ohio, I spent a lot of time there. They have a tremendous program for skills training. I did interview a young woman training to be a machinist from Appalachia, because, you know, Ohio has an Appalachian part of it. And, you know, she said, my life is completely turned around. I'm making, you know, $35, $40 an hour living in Ohio. I can live a pretty nice life. My kids, we can buy a house. That doesn't buy you anything in California. I mean, you know, and somebody who's making $30 or $40 an hour is got no hope of buying a house unless they want to go, you know, out in the middle of the desert somewhere. We don't develop family-friendly housing. What we've done is, by restricting where you can build, only two things can be built: very, very high-end, small apartments, or something that's completely subsidized. And by the way, given the rules now, it is $1 million per unit to build a homeless apartment in San Francisco. I think we're almost there in LA. And you think about it, like, who's going to, you know, how much money do you think we have, you know? Then I think there's going to be the rise of online work. I think one of the hopeful things is, as people move to places like Texas, like Tennessee, like Nevada, like Arizona, they have a better chance of getting into the middle class. The coastal states have really almost, at this stage, don't seem to have any interest in maintaining anything but an elite class and a certain class. Reshoring, that's another big thing that could be going very well. What's interesting is, where is reshoring taking place? Almost entirely in the Midwest and the South. It's not, very little of it is taking place in California, almost nothing. And we have to regulate, you know, these big companies, because they don't have to serve the customers or the public, because they have, when you have 90% market share, you don't have to worry about it. Next one, please. And what we're seeing, obviously, a declining number of people even involved. So we're moving into this sort of society where a large percentage of the population doesn't work and is dependent on transfers. Go to the next one. So what's happening is, people are moving to smaller places. The idea that everyone's going to move to the big cities, which the New York Times is completely obsessed with, I don't know how many years we have to tell them that they're wrong, but it's pretty obvious. About 2014, there was still some migration to the big metros. It's gone completely in reverse. And by the way, before COVID, next. And as you can see, what's happened in terms of this. Now, this is not the story you're going to read in the New York Times, okay? You're just not going to read it, because they don't want to hear it. Because their ideology was all the seniors were going to move back into the city, which is, you know, we did the census, and that's actually, older people leave. I think there's a different future for New York, but I don't think it's going to be older people moving. Go to the next one. And if we take a look at where the growth has been, you can see CBD growth was, in the last decade, was about 1.2% of all the population growth. We go to the next one. And the reality is, most people want a detached house. This is the crime against humanity that you can't talk about, is the fact that actually we know very often you'll have somebody, they're in their 20s being in New York and a little, what do you care? You know, you don't even know where you're going to sleep that night. You know, you're just, at least I remember my youth. So you had this tremendous desire for cities. What we're finding is cities are becoming more or less places for young people and the very rich, and then those who are stuck. But most people want a single-family house, and you know, we're not, in California, we're not providing it, which is one of the reasons people are leaving. Next one, please. And one really interesting part of it, you know, people say, oh, the suburbs are, and the, you know, these states are, you know, these red states are racist. Why don't we just follow where people are moving? This is the foreign-born. We use foreign-born because immigration is where you come in, and we want to know where you end up. So as you can take a look, this is just astounding to me. Dallas, Fort Worth, Houston, and Miami now have had more growth in the last decade of foreign-born than New York City. And LA actually went negative. Something isn't working. Next. And the suburbs are becoming more diversified. You can see white non-Hispanics were 4% of the growth of suburbia. If you go out to the developments outside of Houston, I would say 60–70% population is something other than non-Hispanic white. Next. And again, people going because that's where they can own a house. So, you know, there is a pushback. So I don't think it's hopeless. I think that people are going to demand something different. The question is whether or not there's any coherence. And the big problem, I think, right now is that probably people would vote for a sort of a moderately conservative, intelligent person, like a Youngkin. They don't want Donald Trump. And if that's their alternative, I don't know, maybe, well, my wife's a Canadian citizen, so we always have that. Next. So, and I think we can build a new future. This is what I'm working on more and more. You know, places that people like. Suburbs are increasingly not places where people commute from, it's where they work. And I think we can develop new communities, but we don't have the desire or the ambition to do that, which is really unfortunate. But it is definitely happening in Texas and Ohio and other states. California is a little harder. Next. And the other thing long-term is if you have expensive housing and people don't have single-family houses, they don't have kids. That's one of the things that's happened in China is a very expensive real estate, people living in small places, they're not going to have kids. It's just a tautology. Next. And as you can see, where are people having kids? Jacksonville, Tulsa. So it's going to be very interesting. The cities like New York, but particularly San Francisco, Seattle, LA, have very, very low birth rates. If you go to the next one. So what we may end up with is like H.G. Wells's idea that the city will become a place of concourse and rendezvous, but the family will be completely outside the city. And, you know, not bad for 1904. Next. So just a few last things. I know I've gone on a bit here, but I think the loss of the middle class, persistence of poverty undermines the confidence in capitalism, and I think that's a big issue. When we look at the poll data, a majority of people think capitalism doesn't work. A majority of young people in the United States, there are about as many who are sort of pro-socialist than the other way. Among college educated, it's actually a little bit stronger. There's the beginning of a sort of, you might call it almost a socialist movement. Here in New York, the Working Families Party. In California, we have the Democratic Socialist America. After this last scandal, will probably be about 6 or 7 of the 15 members of City Council will be part of DSA. DSA is a much more radical view than, let's say, what the socialists were saying 20 or 30 years ago. I think it was, okay, so that's sort of it. I could have done more, but I had to spare you. So, Russell, do you want to? Sure. You want me to sit over there?
Please.
Okay.
Great. Thank you so much, Joel. That was really... extraordinary deep dive into some of those trends, and there's so much to reflect on. Now, Russell will help us do just that. We've got about half an hour left, so altogether. So
discussion.
That's right. So
I'll be brief.
Yeah, 5-10 minutes,
Sure.
and then we'll get to the discussion. Thank you very much, thanks, Russell.
Thank you.
Good morning. Joel, thanks a lot.
Thank
It
you.
was really magisterial, covered a lot of topics. I can't even begin to get into many of them deeply. Just a few brief remarks. The description of California is accurate. You left out, of course, the political dimension, and that is that California is a one-party state.
Yes,
So
yes.
it is, I mean, I think of it as the German Democratic Republic, which also prided itself on its technological finesse. The comment that education isn't worth it, be interested to reflect on how close that is to the Peter Thiel proposition. Give you $100,000 if you don't go to college. You can do better with investing. Alternatively, we could talk about the administration's debt relief program, which sounds good, but really benefits those who go to college or who wanted to go to college, and leaves out the many young people who don't go to college, who don't benefit from that. So that's also part of the class bias in a lot of the politics. Just a few reminders. New class thesis originated actually in discussions about Eastern Europe in the 1970s, 1980s. It was a sense of the nomenclatura being developed as a class in the so-called class societies of the East. And Telos was fascinated by this topic and tried to transport it into the United States, and therefore began to talk about the managerial elite, the production of the managerial elite back then. And it was an accurate description, and remains. It's only gotten worse. I think sort of in the larger conservative space, there'd be an interesting discussion to be had about elitism, anti-elitism, hierarchy. Are we really saying that no hierarchy is the goal? And what's the particular problem of the managerial elite as opposed to other notions of elite? You touched on this very briefly, the disappearance of class in a lot of radical thinking, race, gender, etc. But class has somehow dropped out of a central concern. I see this as part of what is sometimes vilified as cultural Marxism. Cultural Marxism replaces culture with questions of class. Now, I think here too there'd be a larger intellectual historical discussion to be had. Telos' role in this, the developments of the notion of Western Marxism. But right now, I think we have to face up to the issue that culture isn't the whole story, and there really are class issues at stake. Post-industrial discussion, that also needs to be interrogated maybe a little more strongly. We may be an industrial society, but we depend a whole lot of stuff on stuff that has been industrially produced. The question is where it's being produced and who's doing the production and what they're being paid for. If we're only post-industrial because capital migrated to China and Southeast Asia to manufacture material that then we reintroduce, then that's not exactly post-industrial. It's more like we don't want to do oil extraction here, therefore we're mad at the Saudis for not doing more of it there. We have to think about this whole topic in a greater global frame. Let me look at my notes here. And what's the response? Well, first, feudalism. Yeah, that's a metaphor here, and we could interrogate that category more deeply. Jürgen Habermas in the late 1950s was already talking about a refeudalization, by which he meant the penetration of economic interests and political interests. That's not exactly what you're talking about. Nonetheless, I think as a first take description of what's going on, the hierarchy, the ideologization, etc., it's useful. I think a real part of the response is peasant rebellions, as you put it. And another name for that, the peasant rebellions, is populism. That populism is a class phenomenon, even if it's not a Marxist phenomenon, and it addresses many of the ills that you've described. It's really a revolt against the managerial elite and an effort to retain life worlds that are under attack. Maybe one final point, and I'll conclude, because I'd like to give the audience a chance to get into this, because there's so many juicy points there. Coming back to California and education, given the description that you provide, Joel, and now speaking as a California resident, it is just stunning, the mismatch between the education that's being mandated in K-12 and the economic challenges that students are going to face. Now hours of class will be taken up by mandated ethnic studies at the same time as math is being effectively eliminated or reduced, diluted. So no more calculus in high school. That is to say, all those minority kids who are going to be provided the pablum of ethnic studies are being educated in a way that makes it impossible for them to get jobs in the tech world. The thoughtlessness, the cruelty, really, yes, of this would be surprising if we were not facing the contradiction that you pointed out, not only in San Francisco, the wealthy city, but San Francisco, the ultra-liberal city. There's a fundamental apathy, disregard of the suffering that one can see on the streets for the homeless and the expulsion of African Americans from the inner city.
And including San Francisco.
Yeah, that's what I mean. San Francisco, that is the paradigm. That is the paradigm. There used to be a significant African American minority. Now it's been pushed to the margins of the city and frankly pushed out of the city because of liberal policies. It's the coast versus the heartland. Schmidt talks about this as land and sea. Right? It's the cultures that are tied into the global maritime that end up with liberal cruelty. Stop there.
Great, thank you so much, Russell. So let me open it up to everyone, and maybe we'll sit here. Sure. If that works for you, Russell, too.
We're very keen to get some questions and comments from you all to Joel, but also, of course, in response to what Russell has just said.
I think you got somebody.
Yeah.
Can I 1 second, please?
Sure.
Yes.
So let's start with Marsha.
Can we get the lights on so that everybody can? Oh, you're working on it. Okay. All right.
I sort of like the cocktail lounge feeling.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering, can we put in our orders now? What is it going to be? An old-fashioned, a martini?
I was thinking of an old-fashioned, exactly.
Very good. Okay, so we'll have 3 old-fashions while we...
No, I have one here. Oh, you have one?
Okay.
So maybe you can share this microphone.
Of course, that's absolutely fine.
So we don't have this.
Yes, I think the echoes otherwise too.
Yeah, so.
That's great. Thank you so much. So, questions, comments from our audience? Absolutely. We start with Marsha, please.
I think you can hear me. I'm pleased to, is this okay? Can you hear me? I don't think it's on. Here, you play with that. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Thanks very much, Joel. It's interesting. Do you want to work that out, or should I continue on?
No, hold on.
We're holding on.
Okay.
Bingo.
And now can you hear me? Thanks, Joel. There were several of the points that you made that came up already yesterday in the initial panel from Joe Boderski and Tim and myself about education, but also about contextualizing education in the economics. I very quickly tried to give
a paragraph or so on some of the economics that you detailed in much greater length today, which especially came up in my nearly 20 years of research on white evangelical populism. So there's a great deal of condescension going on in analyzing this phenomenon in the absence of understanding how did they get where they are, facing a wide variety of duresses that Americans overall face and that they face as well, many of which you've outlined. I'd love your PowerPoint. Happy to give you my stats on white evangelicals.
I would love it, yeah.
And just a small note, you mentioned the economic impact of the COVID transfers, which actually did a great deal gave a great deal of help, although yesterday I also pointed out that about 700 billion had gone to sort of the bottom 80%, and the top 1% or 10% got something like $10 trillion as a result of the COVID transfers. So,
that would be because of the increase in stock
yeah,
prices?
I can give that stuff to you anyway. So there, so the inequalities were not erased by the COVID transfers. Here, in the beginning, you mentioned that you were surprised about the emphasis on race and gender, quote, as opposed to class. And it seems to me that it's not as opposed to, but how race or immigration status or gender intersects with class and influences what class one belongs to, and that's of course very much worth studying. So when you mentioned home ownership, I thought, right, home ownership for whom? Because those statistics have changed to benefit some people of color over the last decades. So we need to look at how race, gender intersects with class. I have an equally substantive comment. The research we all do compares current economic situation to that of our parents and sometimes grandparents, which puts us smack in the middle of the post-war boom. And this, from my understanding of the economics that I've been looking at for decades, that's an anomalous period in American economic history. And that the most of economic history prior to the post-war boom had many, many more ups and downs. The Depression of 1873, the Depression of 1893, we could go on. Not to mention labor abuses, etc. And I just want to throw out from a research perspective what it would do to look at the current situation from a longer longue durée. It seems to me that we have something at the moment, something like an optimism entitlement, right? Because we're comparing ourselves to an anomalous period. Finally, a question. After all that you've outlined in terms of the capture of our economy by certain corporate elites, industry elites, and interests, what else would constrain that other than a functioning state? Certainly an individual cannot, even small groups of individuals. And so I would really, I know there's resistance to an overweening government and regulation and so on, and the corruption of government by corporate interests. But the problem then, if you're talking about the corruption of government by corporate interests, we still have high-tech and elite corporate interests doing the corrupting. Yeah. What would constrain that?
That's a really good question. I wanted, you brought up so many things. The one thing on the economics is you're right that there were a lot of ups and downs, but if you read Robert Gordon's book, he really, he says where over time we made enormous, but you're right, there were ups and downs. It was, because we didn't have the New Deal state, so there was, nobody had shock absorbers, and so when the car went, careening, it caused problems. But we really had a enormously productive over time economy from, let's say, 1870 to 1970, something in that period, again with some obvious negative periods, particularly the Depression. In terms of the the question on you know, I wonder to some extent whether discussion of gender and race and climate is a good way to be a progressive without affecting your own personal interests. I mean, I think that may, I mean, I certainly, we
But you know that I didn't say race and climate and gender. I said the race and gender as it affects class, right? That's the point.
No, and I agree, and that's one of the things that's very interesting what's happening with the Hispanics right now, is that because so many of them are tied to the material economy, which is exactly the part of the economy that's being regulated into non-existence. Like, for instance, happened to be my college roommate was from Bakersfield. Bakersfield is, you know, basically a blue-collar town built around oil and agriculture. Well, I can tell you that the people who work in the oil business actually do very well. They get fairly high salaries. I think we figured about 50% of the people working in the energy industry that Newsom wants to destroy are people of color. You know, you want to use that term, Hispanic, Black, and so, you know, I think Russell made the point about the kind of cruelty that we have. You know, that we tell these kids, we sort of essentially turn them against the country. You know, oh, it's a terrible place, it's done terrible things. And by the way, we're not going to give you any skills to go up yourselves. I mean, that's what I find so astounding and of course, if you take away the productive industries, then, well, where's the employment? Like, for instance, I would have a hard time if I was a community college in California and said, I want to train machinists. But there are no jobs for machinists because the work that the machinists work is now in South Carolina. And so, you know, I mean, I just found, you know, that's why I found like what Newsom does is so incredible. Newsom is probably the cover boy for gentry liberalism. And it's, you know, you couldn't find, you'd really have to, you know, have a pretty good casting couch to get into.
So on Marshall's question about constraints,
right?
What could, and sorry, did you want to come in on that point, Russell? Because I just want to hear Joel on the constraints before we move on to the next question or comment.
Well, first of all, I think to the extent that Newsom is the poster boy for liberalism, I think it's fair to say that American liberalism in its current formation is a fundamentally anti-working class project.
Right.
Which therefore opens the political terrain to what Holly proposes, and that is transforming the Republican Party into the party of the working class. Because the working class is not voting Democrat anymore. You know, what would be the constraint? The state surely would play a role. The absolute libertarian position is in collusion with anti-working class liberalism. Evangelical populism, what was it? Populism, yeah. You know, there was this conference in Ohio where Vance spoke, and it was denounced by liberals as a matter of pro-life New Dealers. So, you know, savor that for a moment. Pro-life, that's a position in the culture war.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you're pro-life, you probably have a future orientation. Therefore, you want your kids to do better, as opposed to the other side of the culture war.
Yeah.
But New Dealers, that's not anti-state.
No.
But it's a state working for the working class rather than a state that is producing an unemployable underclass. Those are two different agendas.
Can I just add something?
Yeah, I'd love to hear you think. Welcome to my world, Russ. Right? I mean, that's yeah.
Because you talked about Ohio, and I just finished an article, will be out Monday, on what's really interesting in Ohio is we've got two people running as populists. The interesting thing Tim Ryan has is Tim Ryan now says he's for fracking, you know, against the college loans. I mean, the only constraint is if I think the politicians realize that if you adopt these positions, there'll be a price to pay. And I think that's, you know, and that's part of the problem with being in California. You're in a one-party state, so it doesn't matter. A guy I know who represents Santa Ana, a Hispanic working class area, and he says, you know what, I don't worry about the right. I don't worry about Republicans, I worry about the left. All my concerns are on that side. So we have to be able to make some sort of price, they have to pay some sort of price if you're going to adopt these positions. I mean, you know, things like defund the police or teaching 5-year-olds about anal sex. I mean, I can't believe that that is a winning position politically. I just can't see it. But and one interesting thing, which may be an interesting and unexpected part of pushback, a group of business people in California, including the Bay Area Council, Jim Wonderman, they're scared. They're really scared now, and they're all these people, Democrats. Jim was chief of staff to Senator Feinstein. There's beginning to be a pushback even among liberals, because what's happened is the progressives have moved them into such an impossible position on the climate issue. What you're going to ban natural gas? Really? I mean, like that. You know, how does that possibly make sense unless you're either profiteering from it or it's some sort of, you know, it's like, you know, it's like, you know, they now treat anything with GHG as the devil's spawn and has to be eliminated. Of course, the one last thing about California is actually by our policies, we're driving out industries and people to places that actually have much higher GHG. Like if I had moved to Houston, my GHG would have doubled. Just because I live in a very temperate climate and I don't have to run the air conditioning and heating, and I don't have to drive much.
Great, let me take a few more questions because we are slightly up against time. So we've got Florindo and David. Let me take them together and then go to response. Florindo first.
Hi, thank you. You talked about how sorry, I hope I'm not too loud. You talked about how home ownership has been really a great asset that has built up the middle class, and you saw that really happening during the post-World War II period. And I would say it was really the result of the creation of Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae and the 30-year mortgage, which existed nowhere else in the world, which allowed people basically to put 10 or 20% down and own a home that they could afford based on their paycheck. Then, of course, as usually happens in these situations, you know, someone along the line says, hey, this is a great idea, why don't we privatize it? So they put it into the private market, and lo and behold, fast forward, we get the Great Recession. And the Great Recession was then bailed out by the U.S. government. Basically, the banks were bailed out, and that's what saved the Great Recession from being the Great Depression.
You got a Nobel Prize.
Right, and Bernanke got a Nobel Prize. That was my next point. Now, one of the things the government could have done at the same time as bailing out the banks is allowed mortgage holders to be able to refinance their mortgages. They were still paying, what, 5, 6, 7%, you know? And interest rates were probably somewhere around 1.5%. Being able to refinance your mortgage would have been a tremendous transfer of wealth to the middle class. But the government did not pursue that. Given that, how is one not supposed to be cynical that when crises do develop, it seems the government always is bailing out the rich and the financial markets and leaving the middle class and the working class basically to carry the water? I will say this, I do think during the pandemic the government had to make more checks out to the working class than they probably normally would have done, but that's only because the markets weren't working. The markets did not exist. In March of 2020, you could not trade anything on March 18th. The bond market went up to 6-7%, but you know what? Nobody was buying, nobody was selling. The government had to again try to come in as the buyer of last resort in order to bail everybody out, because nobody else was buying and selling. And at the same time, you know, people were losing their jobs. So what else was there to be done? But given these circumstances, then, you know, how are you not supposed to believe there really is a class conflict going on, even in a very subtle way at best in this country?
Well, there's clearly a class conflict going on. I mean, one of the problems with, particularly when you have huge problems, big issues, is that you have a big problem with getting, the more complex the problem, the more it becomes the expert. I think it's Winter's book on oligarchy talks about this. And that's why climate change is such a perfect issue, because they can say, we know, you don't know, and we're going to impose all these things on you because we know best. Now, of course, we'll come up with a program that helps us, it doesn't help you, but that's just because that's, people obviously come up with positions that help themselves. And I agree totally, during the Great Recession, that much too much benefit. Who cares if some of the investment banks went under? Other people would come in and start new investment banks. And why didn't we want to help the middle and the groups that got most hurt more than, I mean, there were some wealthy people who lost because of the values went down and they were over leveraged, but a lot of them were, they were people who were buying places like out in Riverside, San Bernardino, and they were the ones who got really hit hardest. And so I think the government could have done a lot of things. One big problem, a large part of the planning community in this country doesn't want single-family homes, doesn't want people to own homes. They think for all sorts of reasons that the model that came out of the New Deal, I mean, the brilliant thing about the New Deal and Truman and then Eisenhower afterwards is it was about expanding the middle class. I don't see anybody focused on that issue as that's what we want to do. Instead, we're talking about transfer payments to keep people from going and burning down Zuckerberg's house.
David.
Thank you. So yeah, it kind of builds off of the comment Marcia made about the kinds of policies, like relatively strong state policies to bring about the kind of results that you wanted. And of course, you're criticizing the bureaucratic state, right, for not being able to do it, and it seems to almost empower a bureaucratic state. And then Russell brought in, about this, right, liberalism is hopeless against working class, and so, there's new hope for a kind of right-wing working class movement. And of course, that's the movement, that has dominated in Eastern Europe, right? This is the model in Hungary, perhaps, but, in Hungary and in Poland, and we see the results of, right-wing movements, right, having some pro-working class policy and seemingly, incapable of resisting these powerful authoritarian tendencies, right? To completely, try to delegitimate and deauthorize and defund independent press, in Hungary and in schools, all those ideas, all the different ideas, that are offered, that are criticized about what the government does, right, are increasingly banned, or in Hungary basically banned. In Poland they're trying to push in that direction, but there's more resistance, right? So, yes, there is this kind of right-wing pro-working class policies. I mean, that's the legacy, that's the tradition of classic fascism, right? And so now we see it come back in this new kind of form. And so I guess, I'm always so hesitant and skeptical about the, these kind of critiques of that state, of that liberal state, and, call for this right-wing empowerment of this working class agenda, because, it seems really like more explicitly authoritarian than anything the left ever proposes. So,
I mean, anything the left ever proposes, like Maduro, like Cuba, like Fidel. I mean, there is a real problem with authoritarianism, but let's not pretend there's only a right-wing problem. Right. And we don't don't have to reach to Cuba and Venezuela. Look at the efforts by the left-wing governments to introduce censorship, outsource it to the tech industry. The press is not only being limited in Hungary or Poland, it's being limited in the United States in what we have access to. So I agree with you. There are illiberal tendencies in the public sphere, but this is not a left or a right problem. The issue is that in the United States right now, in the political field, the liberal side is not pursuing, is hostile to the middle class and the working class, and that has opened up a space for people from Trump to Hawley to be active. This is not a full endorsement of each of those fully, but let's recognize that they are speaking to genuine needs of strata of society that are being ignored by the nuisance of the world.
Just to follow up on Russell's point, I just did a piece in Collector, basically the three faces of authoritarianism, and I think the base of it is all the things I talk about, alienation, people, not being pessimistic and all that. But there are three faces. One of them is this right-wing face. The other one is a left-wing face, which has also become much more, like if you take the Socialist Party of France and Mélenchon. Mélenchon is a Chavez, he looked at Chavez as a model. I don't think a socialist, Jospin or any of the socialist leaders in France would have ever said, oh yeah, we want Venezuela. And so what we find is, like, for instance, the DSA is very pro-censorship. That's the Democratic Socialists of America. Most of the pressure for censorship is coming, actually, in this country, is coming more from the left. Maybe in part because the right control of the media is very, outside of Fox and Murdoch. And when Rupert's gone, they're all pretty much the same anyway. And then I think that to me, the most dangerous part, and since we're in the Italian space, Italian notices, which is what I see as more the corporate state. It may be a liberal state, but its inspiration could in fact be Mussolini, which is the idea that the big companies and the government would have a common program. And that's sort of where we're headed. I mean, when you have the head of the EPA telling the YouTube what should and should not be banned, that's pretty fascist, but in a different way. So there's sort of the explicit, ugly fascism. There's the sort of bureaucratic authoritarianism, and then there's this corporate one, which is what I worry about, just because they have such complete control over the flow of information.
So while it's true, as in response to Marx's challenge before, that the state should play a role, then there's Florinda's absolutely legitimate cynicism, but the state is captured by corporate interests. So that's that's the political space, and one has to act politically, understanding you need a state, but the state is corrupt.
Yeah.
So maybe you need a different form of a state, not corporate, but corporatist, where you would have much more local control, much more subsidiarity, much more responsibility at local levels, and not place all decision-making power in the hands of the swamp in the sea.
At the same time, get the federal government in this country or the central government elsewhere to do the important things it has to do that no one else can do. Because at the moment, the state surveils, controls, micromanages, but doesn't actually do some of the things only it can do. So we've also got the wrong kind of central state government, right? Not one that enables and invests and supports, but one that actually stops a lot of these forces. Now, I think it's for Anthony. Yeah. And then we're going to have to...
So I'll leave you all with a bit of agita. So terms like fascism, et cetera, brought around, somebody mentioned Italy, et cetera. What underscores a lot of that is something that hasn't been discussed here as much, and that is either otherness or race. Italy's fascism was to be Aryan, and so my question is, where does race come into all of this? I just see class and race sort of inextricably bound up together, and That's my musing for the morning.
Just really quickly, how do we define race? For instance, Asians are non-white and they're doing better than whites by a long shot. Hispanics are a universe. It's so complicated. And then even among Africans, one of the studies I cannot get funded, I think I know why. I want to know how Africans are doing in America, because I think they're doing. I know in Houston, the study showed African immigrants were the best educated, wealthiest immigrant group. Nigerians. You know, Nigerians, Ghanaians, and then so I said, okay, so it can't just be skin color, because actually people from Africa are blacker than people from the United States. They could, so there's some, and it's not obviously genetic. They're doing incredibly well. And by the way, I always look at who's upwardly mobile, whoever's driving a cab. Like if in Washington D.C. there are Iranians. In L.A. they were Armenians. In Houston they were all from Ghana.
So then to really close and conclude, Reverend Rivers.
Oh, okay. Just quickly, on the
That's not the show. That was just technological malfunction.
oh, I see. All right. A careful study of the African stuff. One, it's complicated. It's complicated.
Yes, very.
East, west, north, south. It's complicated. The Nigerians. Your Texas case. The Nigerians outperformed the Chinese.
Yeah.
Hands down. No contest. Right. I mean, the big existential crisis at Harvard is sort of funny, right? Is that among Black Americans, the Nigerians were cleaning the Black Americans' clocks, right? So, and it's a tricky deal because one, the affirmative action thing as originally conceived was to meet the needs of the descendants of slaves,
Exactly.
not the ones that sold them.
Correct.
Yeah.
Right. So.
Talk about benefiting at both ends.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Well, yeah, and that's a mixed bag in terms of both ends.
Yes.
Because I got a real hard line on Nigerians. Having been to Nigeria, I'm good, right? But on the race business, all the other groups that you refer to require a much more refined and detailed analysis. Because, for example, there's a book that's just come out that sort of characterizes. It says when brown becomes the new white. In other words, what you call the Hispanic or the Latin thing is morphing as increasingly what were formerly Hispanics, or before that they were Asa. They're now, look, junk all that. We're white. We're just white. In Miami, the Cubans, hey, we're not even on the Hispanic thing now. We're white. We've crossed over.
They're Cubans.
Yeah. Oh, white Cubans.
Yeah, but they're Cubans
yeah,
too.
okay, yeah.
That complicates the issue.
There are a lot of Black Cubans too.
Yeah, right, exactly. But so the transformation of the conception of whiteness and the confusion or conflation of ethnicity with race, right? Just conceptually, because Eugene Genovese, big historian, he had a deep line. He says, look, Black Americans as such are really not a race by any detailed, sophisticated definition. He says there are people.
Yes.
There's a difference. And that was one of Genovese's major formulations. The race discourse is irrelevant. A bunch of liberals came up with that. Then everybody became a race, and then gays became the new blacks. So there you have it. Right. So there's all of that has to be reconceptualized, and I think we've got to go back to Genovese, who had this stuff right, and then the left just went nuts, or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, and just one last thing, because I'm working right now on a study on Appalachia, and you see that we're class, Appalachia is some of the poorest places in America, and there are no Black people.
Yeah,
Of course.
There are no almost no Hispanics.
Yeah.
And I'm working in those places right now, and there the class issues are very, very stark.
But let me just say this with a bit of cynicism. The poor person in Appalachia can, pun intended, move on up and get into the boardrooms of white America easier than the black person can get into the boardrooms of white America.
I don't think that's the case. No. Actually, I would say being a white working class person is probably about the worst place to be, because you now are a privileged person, even though you're dirt poor, and your family's been dirt poor for 200 years. You know, you're not going to get affirmative. See, I would say, like, if you're going to have affirmative action, base it on income and class. Don't base it on race. Why should I have many successful African American friends? They shouldn't have any advantages over my kids. But there are when you go out to Appalachia and you go and you see how people are living, and they are all white and they are all poor.
Yeah.
I think that one last thing, I did a conference in Cleveland, and we had J.D. Vance before he ran for Senate of East Club, and the commentator was my friend Pete Saunders, who grew up in Detroit and lives in Chicago, and he said what J.D. said about what has happened in his community is exactly what happened to his community in Detroit.
Yeah. And if Joel and others working in this space, Michael Lynn from who we're here this afternoon, people like Christophe Guy in France and so on, all of this work is right about where we're headed. And of course, in the course of the next 20, 30, 40 years, some of the people who've done well recently will be sliding into that condition. So we might then see sections of African Americans, Latinos and others, Asians, also sliding back into that poverty because the middle classes are collapsing. So this is going to be an economic, a social, a cultural phenomenon that is going to, not leave any group of society untouched. For all those who are now middle class, they may not be so in a generation or two. Now, I think this has given us a tremendous amount to think about over lunch and into the afternoon. So please join me in thanking very much, Joel.